ahead and be turning to James chapter 1. James chapter 1. We're going to be continuing our study in James 1 this morning and try to finish up James chapter 1. Before we get into James 1, we'll quickly go over our outline of the book, and then we'll review the first part of James 1, setting up where we are in verse 19. The book of James, when we introduced it last week, we pointed out that the book of James is about being a doer of the word. The key verse to the book, and chapter 1 as well, is verse 22 of chapter 1. But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. The book, by the outline we're following here, we have it divided down into three sections. Section 1, which we've already covered, it's the second shortest. Two of these are pretty short sections. But verse 1 of chapter 1 through verse 18 is about overcoming trials of faith. And that's what we covered on Wednesday. The second section is living faith in 1:19 through 5:6. And so that's where you've got being a doer of the word in chapter 1, 19 to 27. Do not be partial, chapter 2, 1 to 13. Have a faith with works, 2, 14 to 26. Control your tongue, 3, 1 to 13. Have wisdom, 3, 13 to 18. Draw near to God, 4, 1 to 12. And then rely on God, 4, 13 through chapter 5 and in verse 6. And then the final section is faith's triumph, 5, 7 through the end of the book. It's patient, it prays for others, and works to restore those that are erring. Now, Wednesday evening, we covered James chapter 1. We discussed briefly verse 2 last Sunday morning, but we covered that and through verse 18 in more detail on Wednesday, this last Wednesday. And so let's quickly review that. The chapter here divides down into 5 sections. Well, first, the key verse we mentioned is verse 22, but be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. This chapter divides down into 5 major sections. The first of those is the benefits of trials in 1 to 8. And let me note again, as I noted on Wednesday, I found some mistakes in the material as we went. Point D is not in your book. And so if you have your book with you, you may want to write point D down there in your book. These should be correct. The slides are corrected. Should be corrected versions of that, as well as point 2 is instructions, not introductions. But the first section in 1 to 8 is about the benefits of trials. So verse 1 is an introduction. That's what we spent last Sunday really covering. Who's the author of the book? Who's he writing to? That's what verse 1 at least addresses. And then there's some questions about who this James is or the 12 tribes. We dealt with that last Sunday. And then in verse 2 beginning is when he begins to hone in and focus on trials. In verse 2, he pointed out that when you fall into trials, to count it all joy. When you fall into various trials. And as we pointed out, trials are certain to come. It's not if you fall, it's when you fall into trials. And when you fall into those, there's joy. And we said the joy is not in the trial itself. That is, nobody, you take the apostles in the beating, and they leave there smiling in Acts chapter 5. They're not smiling because they were beaten. They were smiling because they were beaten for serving Christ. Right? It's not necessarily the suffering. It's the reason for the suffering. It's part of the reason there's joy. The other part of that then is what 3 to 4 points out, that it's the trial produces patience. Knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience, but let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. That word perfect, as we said, means maturity. How do we come to maturity? Well, during trials, one comes to maturity. You've come through the trial and you exhibit that patience. You show the patience. Then you're growing spiritually and becoming more mature. 5 to 8 then is about wisdom in trials. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. As we pointed out and as he talks about in the section, first, if you lack wisdom, ask of God. As we said, there's 2 aspects of wisdom when it comes to trials. One of those is the wisdom to overcome trials. And I think that that's absolutely necessary, and we would understand that from other principles. And the second one, and I think what probably fits the text better, is the wisdom to see the benefits of trials. If you see the benefits, you're more likely to endure the trial. Right? If you understand I'm suffering for serving Christ, and there's joy in that, and you see that benefit, and that there's going to be an end result. You come through this, here's the end result. As we saw in Hebrews chapter 12, chastening of the Lord. When you go through chastening, or when children are disciplined, it's not pleasant for the moment, but what it causes and produces is what we look back and say, you know what, that was worth it. You need wisdom to see that there's benefits and trials. You can come out on the other side, and if you come out on that other side, you are stronger for it, and so you need. Oh, you're right. And that focus or lack thereof, I think is going to tie into some of the other things you're going to say later on. I mentioned this before. James is called Proverbs of the New Testament by some. Part of the reason is its practicality. Part of the reason is, like the book of Proverbs, it feels like all of a sudden we take a drastic, sudden change from one topic to the next. Chapter 3, we're talking about the tongue, and then we're talking about wisdom. Now, there are ways to tie that together, yes, but it seems like there's a more drastic shift. We're talking about drawing near to God, and our adversaries at the beginning of chapter 4, and then we're talking about it, not boasting about tomorrow. And, there seems to be sudden shifts. And we'll talk about all those when we get there. But here in chapter 1, here's the wisdom and benefits of trials, and you need to overcome trials, and here's what happens when you overcome trials, and blessed is the man that comes through temptation, and then be a doer of the word. That seems like a sudden shift, but that ties in there, that relying on God and being a doer of His word and relying on His word and all that is how you're going to come over the trials. And in the midst of trials, you've got to focus on still being a doer of the word. You're right, and even when you think about it, Paul was a persecutor of the church who obeyed the gospel. So some of them, as you're praying for them, they may have a change of heart that causes a change like happened with Paul. Verse 9 now, after doing that, finishing that discussion, or that sort of brief pause for a second on the benefits of trials, 9 through 11 is the instructions to lowly and rich. Verse 9, let the lowly brother glory in his exaltation, but the rich in his humiliation. Because as a flower of the field he will pass away. For he no sooner has the sun risen with a burning heat than it withers the grass, its flower falls, and its beautiful appearance perishes. So the rich man also will fade away in his pursuits. As we pointed out, I think the point he's making here is, you may have a brother who's lowly who becomes exalted, and perhaps the idea may be there. Here's a brother that is lowly or humbled of circumstance, the New American Standard would say, who maybe all of a sudden his fortunes change. As we said, maybe there's somebody that's left a big inheritance, and they went from having very little to being quite wealthy. Or you have the rich in his humiliation. That seems to be, you've got the man that's rich, who all of a sudden he's now the lowly of circumstance. He's rich, and maybe he's the man that he invested poorly in the stock market, and he lost everything. He had a lot, and then overnight it was gone. Because, he says in verse 10, as the flower of the field, he will pass away. Both the lowly and the rich. And the point is, you're driving here, don't focus on those things. Don't focus on the things of this life. Don't focus on the riches of this life. They're here and they're gone. Your life will be gone. And I think when you tie that back to the previous point, remember, and now we're dealing with a writing that seems to be much earlier than Hebrews, but remember what the Hebrew writer pointed out to his audience, that part of the problem they were facing is there was, as part of their persecution was, there was the plundering of their goods. And so perhaps that's a problem happening to those here as well. And a reminder, if you're rich and you lose it all, or you're poor and you gain a lot, it doesn't really matter in the end. What matters is how we live and are pleasing to God. Verse 12 through 15, then the genealogy of sin, blessed is the man who endures temptation. Perhaps again, if you tie it back to the previous point, there's temptation if you're lowly and then exalted. That is, you're humble to circumstance and then you become wealthy. There's temptation if you're wealthy and then you become poor. There's temptation for other things as well. But blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord promised to those who love him. And so we need to endure temptation. Verse 12. Verse 13, he then says, don't say you're tempted by God. Temptation does not come from God. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. Temptation is not from God. Now, as we pointed out on Wednesday, and we'll get to this in a minute, that's then in 16 through 18 where I think he makes a distinction between the two. And section 3 here on the genealogy of sin and section 4 on every good and perfect gift, we could combine those together perhaps, as there's one thought that seems perhaps there, or these two thoughts are at least very closely connected. So what we have in verse 13, we keep that in our mind. We're coming back to that idea, I think, in verse 16 in a minute. But before he comes back to talk about every good and perfect gift, he then gives what we've called the genealogy of sin. And that is, when one is tempted, which he said doesn't come from God, temptation happens when one is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. As we said, that looks different for different people. Some people struggle with one thing more than somebody else, and then the other person will struggle with something that the other person may not struggle as much with. Doesn't mean they're not necessarily tempted, but there's areas where people are more tempted or enticed. Even as time changes, why do we have lessons where we talk about, here's warnings to young people, and here's lessons to those that are middle-aged, and here's lessons to those that are older? Because the temptations can change as time changes, as life changes. But in any case, whether one's young or old or somewhere in between, the temptation happens when one is enticed by, or drawn away by their own desires and enticed. Well, when that then happens, when desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin. So the first thing is there's temptation. Temptation is that pulling by your own desires and enticed. That can be resisted, but when you give in, then there is sin, and sin brings forth death. As we said, there's two deaths it brings forth. Sin brings forth first, spiritual death. Your sin, you're spiritually dead. Ephesians chapter 2. And when left unrepented of, in eternity it brings forth spiritual, or eternal death. You're right, and on that note, 1 John chapter 3, there's sometimes questions raised about it. It used to argue about once saved, always saved, where it talks about that in 1 John about those that are children of God do not sin, some translations say. I think the English Standard Version translates it better when instead of translating, we'll get here the New King James, the New King James says, whoever commits sin also commits lawlessness, sins lawlessness. Verse 6, whoever abides in him does does not sin. Whoever sins has neither seen him nor known him. The English Standard Version would say that those that are in him do not make practice of sin. And you're right, there's a difference in sinning. Somebody that commits a sin and repents of that, and somebody that just lives in rebellion and choosing to sin. And the other side of that, as you mentioned before, some say, well, nobody's perfect. That's true. I said this before, and you've heard others say it before. The absence of perfection does not mean that there should be an absence of striving for perfection. Just because we're not going to be perfect doesn't mean that shouldn't be the goal we're working towards. Are we going to make mistakes? Yes. But we're still striving for perfection. We don't just say, well, you know what, if I give in, it's okay, everybody sins. No, we're striving to live right, and sometimes we make mistakes, and then we repent of that, and we keep going. Right, it's an excuse that's made. Well, you know, I can't help myself is another one. Everybody sins, and they're just excuses to try to say, okay, well, you know, I sin, but it's okay. And sometimes, by the way, people excusing sins in themselves would see something that may be viewed as less significant in somebody else, and that's the end of the world, but because it's them, I just can't. No, you're right, and that idea of blameless, you know, it talks about being without blemish or without spot. In Psalms, it talks about us having, walking upright. I think some translations use the word integrity in Psalm 15. It's actually the word for without spot or blemish that's used of the sacrifices under the old law. It's not that we're going to be sinlessly perfect, but we're cleansed from that to where that's no longer there. As it talks about, it's blotted out. It's as if it didn't happen. Verse 16 now, he talks about the genealogy of sin. He then says every good and perfect gift. He talks about every good and perfect gift. Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good and perfect gift is from above. And I think the deception is twofold. One, don't be deceived and think that good and perfect gifts come from somewhere other than from above. And secondly, don't be deceived. Verse 13, temptation doesn't come from God. Instead, it's every good and perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. And verse 18, as we closed on Wednesday, is an example of that. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. And so he uses that example of us being brought forth by the word of truth as an example of the good and perfect gifts from God. Verse 19 now. This is where we left off on Wednesday, verse 19, be a doer of the word. It spans the rest of the chapter. There are 4 subpoints to this, further divided down. The first of those is verse 19 and 20, let every man be. That is, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, for the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. And so as he's starting this section on being a doer of the word, he reminds them first, you need to be swift to hear. Be somebody that's listening. Slow to speak and slow to wrath. You're not somebody that's quick to respond. I think slow to speak, when you take that in mind, have you ever heard somebody say, you know, I spoke without thinking? Slow to speak is the idea of we're thinking and being diligent in what we're saying. Then slow to wrath. You go back to Ephesians, you remember, and he uses the word anger there, but be angry and sin not. The problem is not necessarily that one has some anger. There is a sense in which anger can be justified. First of all, you've got to be angry about the right reason. You can't just be angry about everything. But secondly, sometimes even anger that is first justified can be a problem if we, as they say, fly off the handle. Right? Stew on it, or even we're just quick-tempered. We have a short fuse and something happens. And so be slow to wrath. It's not something that you just quickly respond to. It's something that if there's a reason you're angry or have wrath, it's because there's a justifiable reason before you get there. And then verse 20, for the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. You want to produce the righteousness of God, that's not by being somebody that has this, a wrath of man, or somebody that's quick to have wrath. Right. Right. And having that wisdom that we'll talk about in chapter 3 in more detail about what type of wisdom we need.
Think about Micah, your dad was here, and maybe he had several of us, but he had me. He said we sit around some of us and watch Fox News, and then we'll find out what's going on before you know it. We're maybe saying things we shouldn't, and that wrath comes out or whatever. You know what I mean? That's a practical way. It may not be you one-on-one. I may be watching Fox News, somebody or some other news outlet, whatever, and they may be exposing things that are going on that are not right in that. But I still got to watch that, and that's where I struggle. I mean, I hold myself up there, but I kind of struggle. Well, maybe I shouldn't watch some of these outlets if it's going to cause me to get upset, you know, and say things that maybe I shouldn't say.
No, you're right. You know, and even as we look at some of the things, there are plenty of things, as you point out, in our society that we have every right to make us angry when things happen, when we see sin and things going on. But it's got to be within that justifiable range of anger. And we've got to make sure that we're justified in our anger, and that not only is it justifiable anger, but the level of anger and the speed of which we get angry is justifiable too. Verse 21 now. There's two parts to verse 21. First, lay aside all filthiness and overflow of wickedness. Part of being a doer of the word, we're going to get to receiving the word in a minute, but part of being the doer of the word, first and foremost, is you've got to put aside this filthiness and overflow of wickedness. Sometimes we talk about it from the other aspect, that when we empty ourselves of something, that is, we cut something off, we've got to fill it with something. Well, before we fill ourselves with the word, you know what we got to do is we've got to cut off all the bad stuff that goes contrary to the word we're going to fill ourselves with. And so this filthiness, this overflow of wickedness, you cut that off. You lay it aside. You put that aside and receive with meekness the implanted word. Now you receive the word. You've put aside the filthiness and overflow of wickedness. Now, that doesn't mean, obviously, you've heard the word, and that's why what turns people to lay aside the filthiness and overflow of wickedness. But I think the point he's making is, especially as you go further in being a doer, you can't just say, well, I'm a doer of the word, and I'm living it as I should, and over here be living in filthiness and overflow of wickedness. You've not really fully received the implanted word. You've got to lay that aside and receive the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. Verse 22, but be doers, and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. And I think that goes back to verse 21, but be doers and not hearers only. Somebody that hears the word and says, you know what? I hear that and I know what I need to do, and then I'm going to hold on to this filthiness and overflow of wickedness. They've not received the word and they've held on to something else. Have they heard it? Well, they may hear it, but they're a hearer and not a doer, right? And again, we're dealing with an audience here that is what? It is Christians. Right? We talked about that last week. Here's an audience of Christians. So here are people that have obeyed the gospel, but some of them may have gone back to this filthiness and overflow of wickedness, and James is telling them, you got to lay that aside. You got to put that aside and be a doer. You've heard the word. You may even believe what's said, and I think chapter 2 is going to point that out. But then you know what? You're not showing that in the way you're living. And so again, we'll get to that in chapter 2, but I think that's the point of chapter 2. Some say they have faith, without works. Show me your faith without your works, I'll show you my faith by my works. It seems there's a problem to those he's writing to, or at least some among those he's writing to, who say, well, I have faith in God, but then they're not living that in their everyday walks of life. And I think Mike made the point, I think it was Wednesday, but in the last couple of classes when we talk about it, being a doer is not just obeying and the gospel, it's living it every day after that. It's not just coming out of the waters of baptism. These people have come out of the waters of baptism. They're not living it now in their everyday life. They're a hearer. But they're...
Hey, Micah, in Matthew 25:26, the one-talent man, when he was being condemned, he said, you wicked and lazy servant. So actually there's a sense whereby me not doing good things I'm commanded to do, James 4:17, that in itself makes me wicked. So in a way, laying aside wickedness is also laying aside the failure to do the good that I'm doing.
You're right. You're right, and I think, and that again goes hand in hand too with the receiving with meekness, that active living of it. Whatever it says to do it. Whatever it says don't do, then don't do it, right? And then be that doer of the word.
Get out of the habit of just taking care of number one and not worrying about setting an example and doing what the good works that we need to do to remain faithful to God.
Absolutely, absolutely, and we talked about in Hebrews and stuff, there are certain things, when we introduced Hebrews 13, let brotherly love, talking about brotherly love continue, and hospitality things, that we may not think about how necessary those are at times, versus we got to put aside fornication, verse 4, and adultery, but at the same time, not failing to do these things will make you just as lost as doing these things over here that we're told not to do. So 22 through 27 now, being a doer, not a hearer only. First thing he points out in verse 22 is being a doer, not a hearer, or be a doer, not a hearer only, because if you're a hearer only, you're deceiving yourself. But be doers and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. I think sometimes when we talk about deceiving, and we talk about deceiving other people, it's possible to deceive ourselves. And that seems to be the situation here with them, is they're hearing what's said, and they're saying, they might come out, and if you can imagine it, they hear a lesson, and they come out, and whatever their struggle is, maybe they're struggling with the sin of fornication, and they hear the preacher preach on fornication, and they shake his hand and say that was a good lesson, and they walk out of there, and they've heard it, and they understand it, and they don't apply it. And then they convince themselves, you know what, I'm okay. You know what they're doing? Deceiving themselves. Be a doer, not a hearer only, deceiving yourself. He then illustrates that. A hearer only is like a man who looks in a mirror and forgets what he sees. But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man observing his natural face in a mirror. For he observes himself, goes away, and immediately forgets what kind of man he was. If you can imagine this afternoon before services, you go to look in a mirror. Now, or maybe after lunch today, you go look in the mirror and you had something to eat with some sauce, and you got a little bit of the sauce on your face, and you walk away, and you forget what you saw, and then you come to church tonight, and you've still got it on your face because I looked in the mirror, but then I walked away, and I forgot what I saw when I looked in the mirror. That's the illustration of being the hearer, or even, let me say, not just being a hearer only in the sense of hearing it taught, but for us today, being a reader only. We read it and then don't apply it. We can look into the mirror, see that something's on our face, and walk away, and then nothing changes. We never clean the face off, and you think, how could you do that? That's what happens often with the Word of God. We may look into the Word, see what it says. Take chapter 2 as an example. Maybe we're showing partiality, and we read about partiality and how we don't need to show it and all this other stuff, and then we walk away from there and we don't change. We've been a hearer only. We're the man that looked in the mirror, walked away, and forgot what kind of person he was. Verse 25 then. The man who continues in the perfect law of liberty is blessed. But he who looks into the perfect law of liberty, that's what the mirror is illustrating, is illustrating that perfect law of liberty, who looks into that perfect law of liberty and continues in it, and is not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this one will be blessed in what he does. Again, using your illustration, that's the person that looked in the mirror, saw they had something on their face, and wiped it off. Right? We look into that perfect law of liberty, we see what it says, realize we need to make some change, and then we make that change. Verse 26 now. Verse 26. If anyone among you thinks he's religious, does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless. Again, James is about practical Christian living. We use the term doer of the word because that's the phrase he uses in chapter 1. But the whole book is about practical everyday living. And so if you think about it, and this is a problem under the old law, you had those under the old law who would go do whatever they wanted, and then when it came time, they'd come for the Passover or offer their sacrifice, and then think everything was okay, and then go worship idols the rest of the time. Now, maybe not to that extreme, but maybe somebody's over here living in the world, doing what they want, and then they show up for Sunday morning and Sunday evening services and Wednesday evening Bible study and convince themselves, you know what, I'm okay because I'm going to services, and over here the application's not being made. And in this case specifically, he talks about the tongue. That religion is useless. You show up, but you're not living right, guess what? Until you make that correction, you're lost, just as if you weren't showing up at all. Verse 27 now. Verse 27. Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their trouble and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. What I want to focus on for just a second as our time's run out. Verse 27 is a verse that was misused during the institutional battle. I've always heard one of the best commentaries on the book of James was written by an institutional brother by the name of Guy Woods. You've heard that name? He debated for the institutional side in a lot of debates. You just skip what he says on verse 27 because his position on verse 27 is that this applies to the church. Just real quick, if you're talking to somebody and they use James 1:27 to argue that the church should take care of orphans and that it's not an individual responsibility, go back through verse 19. Let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak. He that looks into the perfect law of liberty, be a doer of the word, deceiving himself. The focus on the text is not on the church's work, but on what the individual needs to do. And so if somebody comes to you and makes that point, just as a note, you can go throughout the text and show the use there of it's he, him, himself, you, and all of that throughout the text, pointing that it's the individual. And then real quick for our application here, what we're learning from this verse is, again, the applications. We need to show that love and concern for others that's demanded for us in visiting those to those that matter.
Sometimes people are quick to condemn what's called institutional church, whether it's helping the people out of the treasure or non-Christians, or this aspect of visiting people. As I emphasize where they got it wrong, I better make sure that I'm doing what it does me as an individual. Because sometimes we can actually really pound the pulpit there again about how they've got it wrong. But it definitely does mean something, and am I fulfilling what it tells me to do as an individual?
You're right. You're right, and I think just real quick to illustrate that, it reminds me of the point that R.J. Stevens used to make about singing. He always said, we're more against instrumental music than we are for singing. Here's what we're told to do, and we're more about focusing on what we're not supposed to do. And you're right, there's an application there, and how do we make that? Because that's part of being a doer of the word. Without it, our religion, he says, we're not unspotted. Lord willing, we'll pick up at chapter 2 and talk about chapter 2 on Wednesday.